Hey folks, how you doing? Hopefully well.
Good, how are you?
I'm all right. I'm all right. I think like everyone else, starting to feel the semester's wear and tear, right? Starting to slow down. This weather is not helping any, let's be honest. It's like curl up in a ball on the couch weather. So um anyhow, hey, let's talk about this week. We have got it's an important week. We've got some good stuff coming up. First and foremost, today we're going to talk about the interwar years. Try to put in there too this little bit of some excerpts from a propaganda film that Leni Riefenstahl created for the 1934, or I should say, of the 1934 Nuremberg Nazi Party rally. Um, it's a piece of propaganda, but it's actually worth watching because propaganda tells us something about what's going on with the people in the time period. Because otherwise, if propaganda doesn't push the right buttons and pull on the right emotions and, thoughts for people, it doesn't work, right? So it tells us something about what Germans were thinking and feeling at the moment. So we'll watch a little portion of that together. Thursday, we will then wrap up with what we haven't covered today, which will probably be working through a few slides about World War II, and then talking about the Holocaust. And then we'll spend a portion of Thursday introducing you to the QEP exact assignment, which to this point you haven't seen a prompt for because I didn't want two separate prompts out there roaming around at the same time, confusing people. When you have two sets of instructions, they tend to kind of get crossed up in people's brains. And I didn't want to do that. So on Thursday, I'll introduce you to the QEP exact exercise, assignment, whatever you want to call it. And we'll do the intro that day. You'll have the weekend to start doing the legwork on it. And on a week from today, we'll have kind of an in-class, just kind of brief discussion, Q&A, just to kind of see how people are doing on the exercise and help guide you guys. And then on Thursday, a week from Thursday, is when the assignment will actually be due. And again, I'll try to walk you guys through step by step the best I can how to submit this thing because it really is it's clunkier than it needs to be, but not because it's designed badly, but because the powers that are presiding over this study and need to see data and so forth need it in one software, but I need it in another because of grading purposes. So it just is it's a little counterintuitive what we're going to do. So I'm going to walk you through it as best I can and try to make sure everything is, on track, right? So you guys get it turned in well. So
Is that
anyhow,
for the final project?
no, it is not. The final project is due at the very end of the semester. It is the prompt that you already have, but that's why I didn't release the prompt for this assignment, this exercise, because I didn't want them confused. So at this point, you only have talked about the final project. It is its own thing, and it is due Monday, December 1st at 11:59 p.m. as we decided last or two class sessions ago. I will open that assignment box, by the way, here soon. I didn't feel it was a pressing need to since we had more than a month until that deadline.
Yeah,
And so
I was gonna ask, was it like somewhere I could access it so I could get started? But
it
okay,
is the prompt. Yeah, the prompt for the final project is in the folder labeled final project on D2L and has been there since the second week of the semester. So yes, if you haven't gotten in there to look at that, you definitely got to get in there sooner rather than later. So at the very least, you can start getting into the things that you need to get into, start thinking about how you're going to carry out the project. It is definitely, the final project is definitely not a do it in one weekend kind of thing if you want to do it well. So, which I think most people do want to do their best. And I do think there's an opportunity, especially for my for my students who are, artistically inclined or find great joy in artistic expression right? This is your moment to shine, right? To really put that into action. So, oh man. Um, like sitting here in a jacket in my house because even though my heat is on, it's still cold. Why did it get so cold so fast, people? Anyhow, all right. You never know that I'm a northerner originally. Okay, so any questions otherwise about this week? Trying to keep it kind of simple, do it in a little block here, a little chunk of time, just this week. Questions about it? All right, good enough. I don't think, I mean, I don't want anybody getting confused. I don't think, try not to overthink this. The instructions are intended to be as straightforward as possible, and I'm going to walk you through everything, but nonetheless, right? I do still welcome questions and have been answering some via email already. So, okay, then in that case, let's transition over to the presentation. I am going to talk today about the interwar years, which are aptly named. They are the years between the two world wars. And so really we're talking about the years 1918 to 1939, which is going to be confusing and weird to some people because when we talk about World War II in the United States, we talk about 1941 to 1945. That's because we didn't get into World War II until 1941, but it had already been going on for 2 years at that point in time. It really starts in 1939 with the invasion of Germany into Poland. And then we don't get involved until Japan draws us into World War II in the attack at Pearl Harbor. And then promptly after that, Germany declares war on the United States as an ally of Japan. So, anyhow, excuse me, I'm so sorry. Anyhow, let's go ahead and let's get into this presentation then, as is always the case, and especially today, because I was having big time lag earlier today with one of my classes. I am going to turn off my camera so my bandwidth is good enough to share with you everything. And since we're doing video especially too, okay, where'd it go? It took away my presentation. Let me get back to it. Okay, now I can share with you. There we go. Okay, good enough. Gonna move you guys out of the way. Get to that control. All right. Good enough. Okay, so we are headed, as it states here, toward another global war, right? We're talking about those interwar years and World War II. We've already alluded to some of the things that will come to be during the interwar years, especially with regard to the Treaty of Versailles and its very punishing clauses toward Germany and how this leads to World War II in some ways. But I do want to say a few things. One is we are going to try to get a sense of the social environment, the political environment, the economic environment during the interwar years. We are, however, going to largely focus in on Germany because it's really what happens in Germany that in many ways leads toward or leads things in the direction of Germany engaging in World War II. So we're going to put a lot of emphasis on Germany itself. One of the things you're going to see in this presentation is I have several citations in the presentation. Partially it is because I want you guys to know that when I do my presentations, I am basing them in other people's scholarship, unless of course we're talking about a topic I research and then I may be basing it in my own research. But I want you to be able to see that, but I also want you guys to be able to see where to go for some of these things. These are particular pieces of scholarship that I have found interesting. I know others that students of mine have found interesting. And so I put them up there so that if you are interested, you can always go and look, right? And you know, access them yourself and read further. But let's dive on into this. And let's start with looking at the political, the economic, and the social scenes, just kind of in general terms. On the political scene, on the political side of things, I'm going to say we're looking at kind of a reshuffling of things politically, a redefining of things politically, not just in Germany, which we will talk about, but I think you can make the argument kind of globally, we're looking at kind of redefinition. And I say it that way. It wasn't all the way across the globe that we're seeing these kinds of things, but definitely in Europe, Southwest Asia. These are the kinds of big places that we see these things taking place. I will say, in terms of the global order, the new global order, so to speak, after World War One, there really is, I think, a brand new attitude of a desire to avoid any other war like World War One, and the political scene becomes one of greater collaboration in an effort to try to avoid. Oh, forgive me for 1 second. My phone is ringing. Let me make sure it's not an emergency. I don't recognize it, so sorry about that. Anyhow, um, so there's greater, I think there's a sense of greater collaboration coming about, in this time period. Again, out of a desire to avoid another global war. Um, it really comes to fruition in one institution, an institution that is largely the brainchild of President Woodrow Wilson. It's an institution known as the League of Nations. Some of you may have heard of it. I think you could make a very solid argument that the League of Nations is the precursor to the UN. It unfortunately, while it has great buy-in from dozens and dozens of countries across the globe, it has a few fatal flaws that lead to its downfall and the eventual creation of the UN. Um, the League of Nations, though, Wilson wanted to put together, again, some kind of a mediation group that would avoid the war. So if conflict started to break out, what would happen is maybe that conflict could be brought before the assembly of the League of Nations, and maybe there could be mediation of the dispute, or if somebody was being an antagonist, they could be brought in front of the countries of the League of Nations, and maybe global pressure could be put on an antagonist to stop being antagonistic. And these are really good ideas. This was a really good spirit of it, but there were a couple of fatal flaws. One, the League of Nations, even though it had really great support globally, didn't have the teeth to back up those kinds of pressures, meaning they made no provision whatsoever for any kind of military force. And so it was really hard to enforce that kind of policy, the kinds of policies, the kinds of, approval or condemnation toward, global actions, because they had no provision for a military forces. Now, that's one thing when we get to talking about the UN, that's something that when Franklin Delano Roosevelt gets together with his cabinet and at Dumbarton Oaks in DC and talks about the UN with them to design it. That's one of the things that does come to their mind is we are going to need a way to enforce decisions made by the United Nations. And of course, the way that that's done is there are coalition forces, right? Different countries, UN member nations give essentially assign a certain degree of troops, a certain number of troops to the UN peacekeeping forces, right? These guys, of course, wear, even if they wear different uniforms, they always wear blue helmets, right? To indicate that they're part of the peacekeeping force. And I won't say that it's necessarily been always successful. There have been failures, in the peacekeeping efforts. These guys they're a police force. They're not an aggressive military force, and they really do kind of work at a disadvantage because they're always, having to kind of they're on their heels at all times, right? But they can't actually defend themselves until they're attacked and things of that nature, right? Which makes it hard for them, right? They're always at a disadvantage. But I will say that they've also had some successes in going into some crisis zones and restoring a semblance of order there. The other problem for the League of Nations, though, the first of the two kind of global assemblies, is that the League of Nations, while it had dozens of nations across the globe that supported it, the one country that, interestingly enough, did not support it effectively was the United States. Wilson had really been the kind of one spearheading the effort toward this, but he never got Congress to support it. And I think the reason why is Congress was afraid that the League of Nations would determine American policy. And the United States, which had come out of a place of isolationism to join World War One, had really become a global power in the wake of World War One. And I think that Congress was afraid that other countries dictating American policy might take away something of that power of the United States, and they didn't want to give anybody else a say outside of the American government, a say in our foreign policy. So, so this is one of the things that happened. So the League of Nations, I think you could say it was good in spirit, but of course it dies because it doesn't prevent World War II. However, again, toward the end of World War II is when FDR will create the United Nations, and we do see him try to shore up some of the gaps that existed in the League of Nations. All right, and again, not that the United Nations has been perfect, but again, I think the spirit is there again. This idea of wow, we really need to globally police ourselves as a global community to stop these kinds of wars from happening. Now, the other thing that Wilson did was he gave a speech to a joint session of Congress. It's called the 14-point speech. And in this speech, he talks about kind of redefining the boundaries and the political balance and so forth in Europe and other places that have been affected by World War One. And he mentions a concept we call self-determination, meaning that people should have the right, countries should have the right to say, the evidence is there that we existed historically as a country, or we have a unified culture that is the predominant culture of a region. We've had a government system, whatever it might be, that there's evidence there to say we should be our own sovereign country, right? And so, he proposes this as an idea, okay? Now, self-determination has some, again, I like the spirit of it. I like this idea of saying, hey, people should be able to define themselves as a sovereign country. But you can imagine there's some hiccups here. There's some real hitches in this. You take, for example, the fact that it has to be approved by whom, right? Like, who is the determining body whether a country is a country or not? You may or may not get the international community to support you. That actually happened when the last time I was doing research in Spain and was living there. Montenegro pronounced itself an independent country. And most of the European countries kind of weighed in on this because, for all intents and purposes, Montenegro is still part of the continent of Europe. Although the Balkans in many ways have been a crossroads for both, Southwest Asia and Europe, but still, Montenegro was able to legitimate it through the idea, hey, we were once our own sovereign nation, right? We have, these cultural points and so forth. Most European countries said, yeah, that sounds good, right? Go with it. But there were some that were not for it. And that had less to do with Montenegro's legitimation and more to do with what kind of implications it would have in their own situation. So Spain was one of those countries that said no. And the reason why is they had long been arguing that there are two regions of Spain that have always wanted to be independent for hundreds of years. Catalonia, where Barcelona is, has always wanted to be independent, and the País Vasco, the Basque country in north central Spain, has always wanted to be independent. But the argument has always been neither is large enough or economically strong enough to stand on its own. Well, Spain then couldn't say to Montenegro, which is not really all that much bigger than Catalonia, they couldn't say, oh yeah, we're behind you, go ahead, because that would kind of suggest that Catalonia too should claim its independence, which, by the way, not too many years ago, kind of struck out and tried to do it again. But so, it kind of gets in this weird place where who approves? Like, what kind of approval do you need to claim your own country, right? So that got kind of, that's odd. There's also another thing that's weird about self-determination, which is how do you make a decision about what's legitimation for a country? Some countries, it's really easy. So if we go and we talk about what happens in the wake of World War I, some countries are very easy to say, oh yeah, well, that's a no-brainer. That makes sense. One of them is Poland. Poland had existed for a very long time and had its own government, had its own language, historically had its own culture and heritage and so forth and so on. Poland had to be reformed after World War I because the three empires around it, Russia, Germany, and Austria, had gobbled up Poland. That's actually these images you see to the right. The top one is what's called the first partition. There's a second one I didn't include here, but I did include the third partition. And with each one of these partitions, those empires decided, well, this chunk of Poland is ours. Kind of the same way that Austria did with Bosnia-Herzegovina. Well, this portion of Poland is ours. And eventually what you can see with the very bottom one is Poland's gone. And so for over 100 years, Poland didn't exist. Well, then when self-determination got on the table, according to Wilson, Poland makes sense. Poland had been a country. It had its own language. It had its own culture. It's had its own history. That was a no-brainer. Let's go to a more problematic part of the map, the Ottoman Empire. Well, over the course of 600 years, some of these territories had seen movement, migration of people from one place to another. So places that maybe were predominantly, Christian had become predominantly Muslim. Or maybe a place that had been culturally one group became, dominantly culturally another, right? Or maybe there were none of those cultures left because the Ottoman culture had taken over so heavily in an area. So, there becomes these questions. Okay, well, one, what happens? And I'm going to go ahead and pick on people. I see Jordan, right offhand. And I think, let's see, who else do I have here? I have Sentwell also, so I'm going to use you guys. So Jordan was the last group in power. All right, before the Ottomans conquered this territory, right? But Jordan's people were only in power for 50 years. All right. Prior to that, Sentwell's people were in power of that region, and they were in power for 300 years. But Jordan's people were in power more recently. Does that mean they deserve the area? Or does that mean that Sentwell's people, who actually dominated it 6 times longer, deserve it instead? Oh, let's throw another wrinkle in there. What happens, though, if in the course of migration in the Ottoman Empire, it's actually Shiloh's people who have migrated into this area? Neither Sentwell nor Jordan's people are the dominant cultural group. It's Shiloh's people. Now who deserves it? And so you can see where this causes problems. And actually, we talked about it before. In the wake of World War I, when the Ottoman Empire is carved up, there are states made in Southwest Asia that are very contentious because of this situation. You have one dominant group, but this area belonged to this group, and oh my gosh. So this is part of the conflict that we still see going on to this day in Southwest Asia. All right. So that's one more problem. You're like, what good is self-determination, Dr. Gaston? You've criticized it 3 times now. The spirit of self-determination is very good. However, it has some, like I said, it has some problems. Another one is it's fairly easily manipulated by people to justify bloodless conquest. Okay. So for example, in the interwar years, Adolf Hitler, when he comes to power in Germany, is going to say things like, you know what? This northern portion of Czechoslovakia is predominantly German speaking and German cultured and should be part of Germany. Thus, he's going to take that portion, the Sudetenland as it's called, and it will be added to German territories. Okay, so it really is nothing more than just bloodless conquest the way he's using it. All right, so it's not perfect, the self-determination, but it was the concept on the table. Economically and socially, now we're going to focus in more so on Germany. What's the economic and social scene for Germany? Wow, I got one word for you there: turmoil. Any other way to put it. Both economically and socially, things are very, very disrupted by the Treaty of Versailles. We're going to learn economically, the Treaty of Versailles puts Germany in a very difficult place. Its payments are very high, right? And Germany is already in kind of a weak place following World War I economically. Socially, the Treaty of Versailles also divides Germany very heavily because it's the Treaty of Versailles that, well, I should say, it's the other powers in the Treaty of Versailles, Great Britain and France, that mandate that Germany change its government to a democracy before they'll even negotiate the Treaty of Versailles. And thus, you, of course, have some Germans then that say, oh, cool, democracy, I'm good with that. But you have others that say, no, I don't want this newfangled, weird, progressive, democratic government. And I sure as heck don't want a government that our former enemies told us we have to have. So socially, things are going to get really dicey also in Germany. Now, economically speaking, you know that things are going to get worse because 10 years after the Treaty of Versailles, we see the Great Depression, right? The stock market crash of 29 not only impacts the United States, y'all, it sends shockwaves through the global economy. So we're going to see things get worse elsewhere. So let's talk about that government that Germany was forced to create. And literally, we could say that it was not a movement by Germany. It was literally required by Great Britain and France, who said, we will not even negotiate the Treaty of Versailles with you till you come up with a plan for a democracy. You might ask why. Well, I think in large part it had to do with the fact that the old German system required only that the president and the chancellor agree that war was necessary and Germany was off to war. All right. And I think the rest of the powers said, you need more check down than that. Right. In that way that in the United States, the Constitution says that war can only be entered into if declared by Congress, which makes sense because Congress is the closest thing to us and we're the ones who are going to fight the wars, right? So that power should lie with Congress. Then that means that you have got hundreds of people that have to come to agreement in two separate legislative bodies before we can go to war. So I think that's really largely it, was this idea of you need to come over to democracy, thus preventing any kind of quick entrance into war in the future. So to quote Peter Gay, who's one of these people I'm citing in this presentation, even though this is an older book, 1968, still a very good book, and is still referenced, I think, rather regularly by scholars. This was a government that was born in defeat, just like we said. It lived in turmoil, again, because of the people who liked it or didn't like it, and it was very contentious. And it died in disaster, which we know. It gave rise in the end to the Nazi Party coming to power and to the rise of the Third Reich, which of course led to World War II and the Holocaust. So, born in defeat, lived in turmoil, died in disaster. Again, part of the problem that it faced, the Weimar Republic, which was the name of the government that we're talking about, was that it was associated with the Treaty of Versailles. Treaty of Versailles was heavy-handed. It was very harsh on the Germans. Association with that treaty made many people dislike it. There were also many people who said the willingness of those who signed the Treaty of Versailles is also the same willingness to just give in to the Allies. These were the weak links that cost us World War I. In fact, these guys become part of what's known as the Dolchstoßlegende, the stab in the back myth, right? Which is to say, these same weak links that signed the Treaty of Versailles, these same, weak links in the chain that, cost us World War I, right? These are the same guys that probably just didn't put in their best efforts, didn't care about Germany enough, didn't give enough money, didn't give enough time, didn't give whatever it may be. Thus, they stabbed Germany in the back with this formation of government, with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, and with their weak efforts in World War I. All right, so this is one of the things that we see is the Dolchstoßlegende, that stab in the back myth. All right, and that's one of the perspectives taken by those who hate this government and hate those associated with the government. Now, let's face it, there are plenty of people who don't like, governments when the economy is bad. They get mad at the government. I mean, I think you could say most of the times that we see presidential shifts or party shifts in the White House, in this country's history, it has largely been about economics more than anything else. So, nonetheless, that's not a new feature of governments, right? Especially modern governments. The poor Weimar Republic didn't have a chance. It was economically handcuffed from the beginning. It had its terrible heavy reparation payments because of the Treaty of Versailles, payments that were, not only heavy, but were long ranging and would have gone on clear into our own time, right? If they had been allowed to continue on. Then Germany, on top of that, had wartime loans that the government had to pay back. So it's inevitable, you can imagine, that the government's going to default eventually on its payments. It cannot make them. That finally happens in January of 1923. What happens next is absolutely tragic. All right. So as I said to you, um, the government essentially, cannot make its payment. There's a clause in the Treaty of Versailles, right? Forgive me for 1 second. Something has popped up on my computer, and I'm trying to figure out how to get rid of it. Um, all right. I think I got rid of it. I think we're good now. Okay, I was afraid it was going to shut me down there. All right. Anyhow, so there's a clause in the Treaty of Versailles that says if Germany cannot make its payments, that instead it can pay Great Britain and France in product equivalent to the payment. So when they can't make their payment in January of 1923, Germany or France and Great Britain say to Germany, hey, you can pay us in product. And in particular, they say, we're happy to take lumber and coal from the Ruhr Valley. All right. And the Ruhr Valley is kind of a northern region of what's called the Rhineland, which is the Rhineland is where France and Germany meet up. All right. That's the borderland there. It's called the Rhineland. Anyhow, and Germany says, you're going to take coal and wood away from us in January? Like, people need this to heat their houses and cook and so forth. Like, no. And France says yes. And they literally line up troops on the border and they say, if you don't deliver it, we'll send the troops in and we'll take it ourselves. Well, essentially the Germans say, okay, well, come on in and take it, right? And the lumberjacks and the coal miners in the Ruhr Valley say, well, we're not gonna give it to them. We're not gonna work for them and get them what they're asking for. And the German government says, that's cool. You don't have to. But then all of a sudden, those coal miners and those lumberjacks go, wait a minute, we need money to buy food to feed our families. And the German government, get ready for it. This is the worst thing they could have done. Says, oh, that's cool. We'll just print you some money to use. Oh, no. Man, if you put money into circulation and you don't take money out of circulation, it devalues the money, right? So we start to see inflation. All right. The economy was already, the money was devalued because the economy was so weak. And then they do this and they make it worse. And then 6 years later, the stock market crash, sends out its shockwaves through the global economy. Oh, man, you can imagine what kind of a place Germany was. You guys have heard the stories, I'm sure, about, wives going to their husbands' workplaces to get the paycheck first thing in the morning and take it to the bank. Because if they wait to the end of the day, that paycheck might be worth only 60% of what it was at the beginning of the day. I mean, it's bad news. You see the numbers of like how much it costs to get a loaf of bread or, all sorts of, it's crazy how bad the inflation got. So that is going to make people hate the government for, the fact that the economy is so bad. But there's another thing that they don't like. There are many, and I should put this in quotation marks, there are many that see this government as quote unquote too liberal. Okay. One thing being that it does allow for free speech, which includes critical speech of, the government getting involved in World War I. And there are many people who think that this is inappropriate. You shouldn't criticize a government for getting involved, your government for getting involved in World War I. You should be loyal to your government and so forth. And the reality, of course, of free speech. And we know this in the United States. We've had, trials over this, right? Court cases over this. That is just part of free speech. And we have to just accept it. That, there are going to be people who are critical of things that have gone on in the past. It just is what it is. So, nonetheless, that's one thing that, some people are like, wow, well, this government just allows people to be kind of willy-nilly, critical of the government. All right. But the other thing is, and I think this one in spirit is a good idea. It probably was poorly timed, though. The Weimar Republic was designed to give people the best possible representation in the assembly they could have. Now, what do I mean by that? In our own era, we live in a system that is a two-party system. I mean, there are some independent parties, but largely a two-party system. And I think most of us at any point in time might say, you know what? I am a member of this party, but I only really like maybe 70, 75% of their present platform. Or you might say, well, I'm a part of this other party and maybe I like 75, 80% of the platform, but I don't like some of the platform. Well, ideally, you would want your people in your country to have representation close enough where, is as close as possible to 100% agreement between the person and that party's platform. But if you're going to do that, you have to have a lot of parties. And that's actually what the Weimar Republic did. It wanted to give people great representation. So there were several parties that were in the assembly, in the Reichstag. And the problem, of course, with this is when you have several parties, you have to get them to get along on things. They have to be able to see eye to eye well enough to create an agreement, a coalition to pass legislation. But of course, it falls apart easily because you can maybe get a group together and then there's one little thing that shifts in what's in the discussions, and then all of a sudden the coalition may fall apart. And the problem was, this was what was going on in the Reichstag, in the assembly, is that there were too many political parties. It was hard to get things accomplished. And quite honestly, Germany needed decisions. They needed decisiveness. They needed action in this time period. And while the idea was really good to have a variety of representative parties, it probably was not the right time for it, honestly. They probably needed fewer, just, a much more moderate number of parties involved here. All right. And I think you can make an argument that that's one of the reasons why some people supported Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party, was because as the powers slimmed down to just one, right, that made things decisive, that made things, quicker to get action on. Of course, there's a trade-off for that. You're sacrificing democracy and you're sacrificing your rights and your voice, in return for what, you see as quicker action. Okay. So, and of course, we also know the other sacrifices that came with allowing the Nazis to come to power. But we do know this, right? Adolf Hitler was not a prominent member of the Nazi Party originally, but after he got out of jail, he was in jail for a period of time for trying to overthrow the Munich municipal government, in what's called the Beer Hall Putsch. After he left this, he did climb the ranks of the party, and eventually got elected into the assembly, put together a coalition both through negotiating with people and coercing people, and got enough of a coalition to support him being elected as chancellor, the head of the assembly. The next month, after in January of 1933, he was pronounced chancellor. The next month, February 1933, a fire burns the Reichstag building, right, almost completely to the ground. And at that moment, as chancellor, Adolf Hitler invokes a clause in the Weimar Constitution that says, in a state of emergency, all power goes to the chancellor. All right. Now, I don't think it takes a whole lot of connect the dots to figure out that this mysterious fire happens, and then he declares a state of emergency. I think most historians say, well, we don't really have huge amounts of evidence for it, but it stands to reason this was probably done by the ground level members of the Nazi Party called the Brown Shirts. These guys were antagonistic. They beat people up in the streets. They beat up priests. They beat up members of the Jewish community. They tried to provoke fear, et cetera, et cetera. These guys likely were given the order to do this thing. But, I don't know as anybody necessarily has great proof. But this takes us to an interesting question, right? We know that this is how he comes to power, but there's this question I think that always sits out there. Historians have been asking it for generations. How did it come to be that people supported Hitler to the degree that they did, and supported the Third Reich until its fall? And there's been plenty of scholarship on it, and we're going to enter into some of these things here in a second. But I kind of, before we get there, I want to show you the film and talk about it. Okay. So the film we're about to look at is, as I told you, a propaganda piece that is essentially staged to be about the 1934 Nazi Party rally in Nuremberg, Germany. All right, Nuremberg is a city, very old, medieval German city that sits in the south of Germany in a very conservative region where they knew they would have support. And the woman that directed and produced the film, or directed the film, rather, I shouldn't say didn't produce it. I don't know who produced it. She directed the film. She was an actress, a very prominent actress in German cinema in the time period, and Adolf Hitler, who was a huge fan of movies, really liked her work, and then had his minister of propaganda ask her if she would create a film of this Nazi party rally. Her name is Leni Riefenstahl. The film itself has quite a bit of innovative film work in it for the time period. And Leni Riefenstahl was always very open about the fact that she was glad she got to advance cinematography. However, I think, clear into her deathbed, she still always held strong to the idea that she regretted the fact that the film had been used to bring to power a party that would provoke World War II and carry out the Holocaust. So let's jump into the film for a second. And again, you might say, right, like Dr. Gaston, what's the point in watching propaganda? Well, as I said to you before, propaganda only, oops, hold on one second. I'm talking and not going to the right place. Propaganda only works if it speaks to the people with regard especially to like issues that are really bothering people, or feelings that are already brewing inside of them, or so forth. It uses those kinds of things. It uses fear, it uses hope, it uses all sorts of emotions to try to manipulate people into support or into actions in particular ways. It plays on what's lacking in their life or what they value in their life. So we can actually tell a lot about the audience, really, more than anything else. Oops, I got to get back here to share with you guys. Okay. So we're going to take a look at this. And again, what I will do is hold on, I need to share with sound. There we go. I can't talk and do this at the same time. My apologies. I'm not that talented. So we're going to take a look at this, but we're going to, I will not show all of it. It's a fairly long film, as you can see, an hour and 45 minutes. We'll watch certain portions of it. I will chime in occasionally to kind of explain a few things here or there, and then we'll move on. And I just want to get you guys just a small snippet of this. But with that said, let me go ahead and start this thing rolling.
Dr. Gaston, I think it's muted.
Does that work now?
I still can't hear it, no sir.
Is that true? Everybody can't hear it?
I can hear it.
Check your speakers, Will. See if they're turned down. Here, I'll keep playing so you can check it. All right, so you could see there, they talk about, 20 years after the outbreak of World War I, 16 years after, quote unquote, after the suffering that begins in Germany, which is the end of World War I. Then they mention 19 months after, of the, into the redemption of Germany, essentially, which is, of course, the rise of Adolf Hitler to power. Now, this next section, literally, this is one of those innovative tactics that Riefenstahl used. She did a lot of aerial footage at the very beginning of this. Did a lot of really beautiful cinematography work with it. It's a very long, actually, section of the film, right, where she's working through this. But so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to keep moving forward. I'm going to take us into him with Adolf Hitler landing and to the parade scene. All right, so the next thing I'm going to take you into is the night rally that night. This was something that was used fairly traditionally at the beginning of the rise of the Nazi Party. You can see it's kind of a torchlit rally. This was something that was put together by the Minister of Propaganda, Josef Goebbels. He realized early on, when the Nazi Party didn't have the numbers that they would like to have, that they could do these kinds of torchlit ceremonies. And when they marched in, the shadows coming from different directions, from different sources of light, would cast, or I should say, different points of light coming in toward the parading soldiers would cast shadows in different directions and make it look like there were more of them than there really were. This is one of Goebbels' this is what he did. He was a propaganda minister, and he found ways to kind of psychologically control the crowd. He's also the one that created the Nazi salute, which, kind of like with the casting of shadows and making the numbers look bigger, essentially kind of gave the impression of, oh, there's lots of people supporting, everyone should support, you should be part of this. It kind of exerts that peer pressure. With the salute, it's a visible sign of support that then kind of exerts pressure on the person next to you to do the same thing, or else it stands out that you're not doing it. So let's go from the night rally and go on to the next morning. And now it transitions over to the rally, and in particular to the Hitler Youth Camp. All right, I'm going to come, since we're discussing now, and I want to be able to make, see you guys. I don't know, what do you notice? What stands out to you? It's a propaganda piece. It's intended to speak to the people. I don't know, interpret this. What do you see? Will, go ahead, please.
I'm pretty sure it's with most propaganda, but they don't ever show any of the bad parts. They don't show like a weak link or anything like that.
Yeah, for sure, right? I mean, anything you're trying to support in propaganda, you certainly want to point to the positives. Did you notice any particular positives that they're emphasizing here?
The only one that I would point out is that they were kind of helping out the younger generation of kids because they were teaching them how to shave. They were kind of putting them in a group just so that they would get along together, I guess. But at the same time, I feel like it would probably backfire a lot because if they were trying to be they're a military society, and if they saw any kind of weakness, I bet they would probably bully anybody.
Right, but in this moment where Germany is kind of struggling with its own kind of identity and existence and feeling very vulnerable and weak and divided, those kinds of things were, one, pointing to the kids is pointing to the future, right? Even though showing mothers with children is kind of a reference to the future of Germany, these young men who, we know this for a fact, that there were parents who were won over to the Nazi party because they looked at the economy and said, well, we haven't lost our jobs, but our sons will never have a future at this rate. And then Hitler offers the Hitler Youth as an alternative to these guys in their late teens, early 20s, mid 20s, not having jobs because the economy is so bad. And the parents are thrilled that these guys have something that seems productive to do with their life. It seems like it's contributing to something related to the government. Now, you're right, Will. You called it exactly as it is. the Hitler Youth was intended to train soldiers that were going to essentially invade Poland, invade Russia, invade Scandinavia, invade France, right? And we can just keep going, right? But that at the moment may or may not have dawned on people. I'm sure some people kind of wondered, but this is kind of playing on the fears of parents that their kids aren't going to have anything. And then you get this last scene, right, with its polka band, beer garden, Oktoberfest music, right? And I don't know, what do you make of that?
I feel like it was to maybe inspire a sense of nationality in the people.
But for sure, that's a very German style of music. And there's great camaraderie in going to the beer garden and drinking with your buddies and great unification and joy. Joy was kind of in short, like supply in this moment in Germany's life, right? So all of these things, right? Like, look, the Nazi Party is this unifier, and they bring camaraderie, and they bring this kind of like sense of connection in German. It's funny you brought up the Germanness, Will, because you guys may have seen there was those two statues in the parade that were like fountains. I guess one was a fountain, one was not a fountain. um I don't know, there may be some folk tale that goes with the farmer, although farmers are kind of, we always think of them as kind of salt of the earth, connected to the land. We always kind of associate them somehow with whatever nationality, right? The other guy, I don't know if any of you did any of you recognize the guy with the walking stick in one hand and the book in the other hand? I'm just curious if anybody knows their German literature. That's fair. The guy's name is Johann von Goethe. I just put his last name in the chat. Goethe is like the Mark Twain of German literature. So like when you talk about like quintessential German literature, Goethe's the guy that gets referenced always, right? And so there's a real reference to Germanness there for sure. Yeah, yeah. What else did you see?
Hitler
What
in
about
the
him?
beginning. He was on a he was waving to a crowd of people. It seemed like he was elevated, you know,
Yeah.
physically put on a pedestal, but seemingly metaphorically as well.
Yeah, but still accessible to the people, right? He was doing the Nazi salute, but Sophia, I'm glad you said it that way. It looked in many ways more like he was waving, right? Like when he gave the salute to the soldiers, it was very rigid. It was very like stark and harsh, right? But when it was with the people, there was something very strangely humanizing about the way that she portrayed him, right? Even to the point where I don't know if you noticed it, but like there's something, he somehow hurt his pinky, I'm guessing. He could not put his pinky up against the rest of his hand effectively when he relaxed his hand. I'm probably sensitive to that. I had to have my pinky reattached, so I noticed those kinds of things. So you're like, ooh, that's a gross story. Can we hear it sometime? I don't know. We'll see. But it was strangely humanizing and softening, wasn't it? Like we know what this guy is going to do. But this is, you can see where the propaganda is kind of making him accessible, like the little kids handing him bouquets, right? And the people are walking right up to his car and stuff, right? And it's just like, we know that's staged, but you know, yeah. Will, what are you thinking?
Was it Hitler or was it Stalin that had Parkinson's and like had a really shaky hand? I can't remember.
I don't know. I've heard neither. Um, but it could
But
be the case.
I thought I heard someone say something, or I saw like a statement online, like one of them had like Parkinson's and they were always hiding their hand.
And that might have been Stalin. I know Stalin did have some health issues, but and so it might have been him. I don't know. I'd have to look further into that. That's not something I've seen brought up in scholarship. But yeah, Jordan, go ahead. Oh, okay, fair enough. Well, yeah, I mean, and it may be the case, right? There are historical epidemiologists that do look at these kinds of things, and they will they'll read letters or reports about certain kinds of symptoms that people have, and then they'll work to try to figure out if there were diseases. I've never worked with anybody or read anything of historical epidemiological background on either of those leaders, so you guys may be right on that. Um, so, but again, yeah, it was something that would never be known because these are both figures that were intended to be strong in a moment where both of those nations were really trying to get on their feet and become a global power. Um, I mean, you say that, and I mean, we could talk about it from the FDR standpoint too. FDR used to give speeches because of his polio, right? He used to give speeches holding himself up with his forearms on the lectern. You talk about a physical specimen, right? Because again, and he said he admitted it, right? That the reason why he wouldn't do it, he wouldn't just sit in a wheelchair and give a speech, was because the United States coming out of the Great Depression needed to see strength, right? So yeah, I mean, these are all forms of kind of like, I mean, they're all forms of propaganda when you get down to it. But perhaps some, you know, seemingly with better intention than others. So, or connected to, kind of better programs, better plans than others. Anyhow, um, yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff in there, right? Like there's the reference to the like the whole wagon full of lumber, the Ruhr Valley crisis. I mean, that would have spoken to people. The amount of food that is shown there, right? The huge vats of food, right? And then of course there's all of the kind of pushing the buttons of like, well, everyone's supporting him, you should too. How many of those tents at that campsite really had people in them even? I mean, we can't prove or disprove it, right? We have no idea. But it certainly sends a particular message if you see all those tents in that aerial view, right? Yeah. So there's lots to talk about. It's a very loaded film, and it would have not many of those things would have been picked up on very easily, I think, by an audience very affected economically, socially, politically in the time period. So yeah, for sure. And that's why we take a look at that as much as anything, to not just to see the tactics of the Nazi Party in gaining support, but honestly to kind of get a vibe for what's going on with the people in that time period. What spoke to them. So all right, let me jump back in and let's kind of get back to that same question, but let's get back to that question with regard to what scholarship has been done. Answering that question, why do people support Hitler? Well, I've got press and propaganda there. Again, Goebbels was, the minister of propaganda and issued all these different kinds of tactics, right? Created a variety of tactics, and they were effective to one degree or another for sure. But there are other things too, right? Goebbels was actually the one that kind of came up with this very first one too, although it wasn't his creation. He just saw an opportunity. As Ian Kershaw points out in his book, The Hitler Myth, there had long existed folklore that a man of the German people would rise up and unify Germany and bring it to prominence. And here's Germany, which has only been, by this point in time, a country for less than 100 years. It unified all these various states that made up Germany, and rose to the prominence as an empire, and then lost World War I and had territories taken away, told it couldn't have its military, all sorts of other things that were very weakening. And people apparently started to think, well, there's got to be somebody who rises up from the people, almost like a messianic figure that comes to save us. And that was part of a long-standing lore. That figure in folklore was called the Führer. This was not a term that Hitler came up with, even though he adopts that title and it gets used for him. And he's not even really the one that identified that this might be useful. Like I said, Goebbels tells him at one point after Hitler's gotten enough public attention, he says, I think you could probably call yourself the Fuhrer. And Hitler didn't agree with him at first, but eventually he listened to Goebbels and started using the term. And this, of course, he fit into this kind of like, kind of title then, right? He slid himself into this place of interpretation by the people, right? Another thing we know, and Schoenbaum points this out, is that Hitler was very good not only at public speaking, but he was very good at mobilizing people, especially those who were upset, downtrodden, in a state of kind of crisis, right? He calls it, Schoenbaum calls it, the disaffected, but meaning that, if things were bad for farmers, he would go and speak to farmers in rural Germany and say, agriculture is the heart of German existence. 70% of the economy should go to agriculture. And then he could fly to Hamburg the next day, which is an industrial city. And he could say, industry is the heart of German, existence. Industry should be, 70% of the German economy. And in an era where, one, the press wasn't as present as it is now, and it wasn't on a 24-hour news loop, right? This made it hard for the press to check down on him effectively. In addition to that, and he was starting to gain control over the press, even early on in his rise to power. So he could talk out of both sides of his mouth, essentially, and make promises that he probably had no intention of keeping, really, and mobilize the people. Schoenbaum also points out that one of the things that helped Hitler gain power was a lot of times people were so kind of caught up in the problems on the ground level that the brown shirts were causing, where they were beating up members of society, where they were destroying property, they were beating up priests and clergymen for the Protestant churches, and they believed that Hitler was so involved with high politics that he didn't know these kinds of things, but they figured he could rein them in. So there were some people who were willing to say, well, I think if we give him this power, right, he can kind of bring peace and calm to these lower levels. And of course, we know that it's likely that he and his cabinet of people knew exactly what was going on the ground level. Another one of those things that several scholars have pointed out may have helped to benefit the power of the Nazi Party was that the original budget and economy plan really did look like it was going to benefit the people. There was a formation of a brand new Ministry of Industry. It was run by Hermann Goering, and Goering started an entire complex of factories known as the Goering-Werke, which made products, used government money to help reduce the cost of products. It also made products that had been too expensive for most people more affordable, so there was a bigger market for them. And that includes cars, where most people couldn't afford cars. Mercedes-Benz were way too expensive for, the vast majority of people. And by contrast here, the government then opened up a factory to make the people's car, literally the Volkswagen. That's what it means, the people's car. And so, this was a matter of making accessible things that people hadn't been able to get, or making cheaper product that people could get, had always been getting, but could get cheaper now. And we know the reason for these things. We know that the building of new factories and the creation of a brand new industrial kind of complex was largely about trying to figure out how to create factories that would eventually support the war effort. And people were, I think, really good with it until they got deep into the war and saw that, one, those economic plans were really about the war in the first place, not about the people. But in addition to that, they were having to start giving up the things that they had been getting for the war effort, which was dragging on for years and years and years. And that's one of the things that brought support down for the Nazi Party. But I will say that even up front, and this is to the last point that's down here, Hitler was so aggressive toward the other power, the people who had defeated Germany in World War One, standing on the steps of the Reichstag and tearing up a copy of the Treaty of Versailles, or that the wars that were enacted up front were so quick and so aggressive that people were, I think, in some ways, kind of enamored of the idea of Germany winning and rising again to a prominent place in European and global society, that they were okay with this. But like I said, as it dragged on, then they kind of wore thin on that stuff. So when we next get together, what we'll do is we're going to dive into looking at the transition into World War II. I will tell you that we will only spend a couple of slides on World War II. I am always, though, very open with people like, hey, if you're really interested in studying World War II, Dr. Orgill, who's really a really good historian that, you know, is on faculty with us, he teaches a class on World War II. His area is the World Wars. Germany is his place of research. And, you know, he teaches a very good class on World War II. If you're interested in having more detail, definitely take his class. I'm going to kind of move through World War II fairly quickly and into the Holocaust. And then as soon as we get done with our coverage of the Holocaust, we will move into discussing the QEP exact assignment. So we can get you guys staged for that over the course of the week that's coming, you know, so we can get that done and get that thing turned in and, you know, let you guys have that experience. So anyhow, questions on any of that? Okay, good enough. Well, then in that case, I will see you all Thursday. All right. Be well. Take care.